So the first book that I wrote is called Perfection to a Fault, A Small Murder in Ossipee, New Hampshire, 1916. And it's a fascinating case about a sensational trial and murder that happened at the turn of the century. And the intriguing thing about it is Frederick Small was a middle-aged man from Boston. And he went up to Ossipee and he bought a cottage on the lake up there. And this was about 3 years back from when the murder actually took place. And he took his new wife, Florence, it was his third wife, up to the cottage to live with him. And on September 28th, 1916, he boarded a train with the high school principal in Ossipee, bound for Boston. They were going to settle a little insurance that night. And at 10 o'clock in the evening, the cottage caught on fire, burned to the ground, with his wife still inside. Now, even though Frederick was in Boston with an airtight alibi, the sheriff of Carroll County accused him of murdering his wife. How could he possibly have done it? Well, that's intriguing enough, but that's not why I wrote the book. I wrote the book because my grandparents in the 1950s bought a cottage on Lake Ossipee, New Hampshire. And my parents were going to rent a cottage on Deer Cove. And they liked that area of the lake better. But my grandparents said, why would you do that? We've got a cottage, it's sitting here, it's going to be vacant that week. Why would you rent a cottage somewhere else? Well, my parents didn't feel like they could, say that they didn't want it without hurting their feelings. So the next week, my extended family came up there with my grandparents, my brother, and my mother and father, and me, although I was a baby at the time. And they spent the day. They had a cookout, they went swimming, and they took the boat out, and they had a really great time. And then one by one, each family left. And as they were leaving, my mother started to get this kind of lonely, cold feeling in the cottage. And she just chalked it up to, well, I've had a fun day, lots of people around, now people are leaving. Of course you're going to feel a little let down. But it seemed like more than just a little let down. Well, my grandparents were the last to go because they wanted to show my father how to close up the cottage before they left so that it would be secure before they came back. So my grandparents went down the dirt road, and my parents were waving to them, and they noticed an old man vagrant walking into a trail in the woods right by the cottage, and he had flies circling his head. And my father looked at the gun. He had a rifle that he had propped up on the kitchen wall, and now he's thinking, felt the bullets in his pocket, never really thinking he was going to use them, but now he's thinking maybe he's kind of glad he has that rifle with him, because who knows? So my parents walked into the cottage, and immediately they just felt uneasy. And it could have been because there's kind of a musty smell in that cottage. The fieldstone foundation always leaked, and there was at least a little bit of standing water in the cottage all the time. And it could have been the evergreen trees that were really grown up around it, and they shaded the cottage, so there wasn't a lot of sunlight that came in. Or maybe it was the fact that there were no shades in the windows, and when you turned the lights on at night, you felt exposed when it was dark outside. Or maybe it was the fact that the only finished wall in the cottage was the kitchen, and it had knotty pine walls on it. Everything else was open studs. And if you stood in just the right spot, you could actually feel a breeze coming in from the outside. That's how well built this cottage was. So my father looked and saw my brother, who was 2 years older than me, lying on the couch fast asleep. And so he scooped him up, put him in a bedroom, and tucked him in, and they went back to the kitchen. And they decided that they would play cards and listen to the Republican convention that was going to be on the radio that night. So they started dealing, and then my mother looked at my father and said, do you want to check the windows? It's really chilly in here. I think you might have missed one. Well, my father felt chilly too, so he thought, well, sure, why not? So he went around and checked all the windows, and they were all closed and locked. But then he walked outside to check the door, like the knob on the outside, and make sure it was locked. And when he walked out, he noticed a warm breeze just blew right by him, right into the cottage. So he stepped out for a minute, and it was really warm outside, and immediately he felt better. He couldn't explain why he felt that way, so he went back into the cottage, closed the door, and never mentioned anything to my mother because he had no explanation for how he felt. Well, they were dealing the cards and they were playing Jim Rummy, and they were listening to the radio, and they actually started to relax and have fun. And they were laughing and everything, and they were on their third hand, and all of a sudden there was a blood-curdling scream that came from the room that my father had put my brother in. And it sounded a little bit muffled. So they were on their feet in a flash, and they were in there, and what they saw was my brother's feet were on the pillow, and he was thrashing around and kicking. His head was actually under the covers, so he had kind of turned his whole body around, which you've never done anything like that before. So they were prying the covers and blankets and things off him, trying to get his head out, and when they got him out, his head was beet red, and the sweat just dripping down him along with a lot of tears. So my mother grabbed my brother and hugged him and looked at my father with tears in her eyes and said, "Let's go." And so my father thought for a minute, and then he thought, well, it's dark outside, there's no light, I can't get the boat on the trailer, and I have to secure the cottage. So we have to wait until there's daylight, and then I swear we'll go. Well, my mother wasn't too happy about that, but what could they do? So she thought for a minute, and then she thought, we'll sleep in the car, it's a station wagon, there's plenty of room. Well, my father thought about that, and then thought about the vagrant that he saw going in the woods, and wondered how many other vagrants he was meeting up with in the woods, and said, I don't feel I can keep you guys safe there. So what they decided to do is go into one bedroom where my crib was and I was, and there was a full-size bed next to the crib. And they all, my brother, my mother, and father, all crawled into bed fully clothed for the night and barely slept all night. And as soon as the sun came up, my mother grabbed me and my brother and sat in the car. And my father sighed and went and loaded up the the trailer and the boat onto the car, and they drove down the dirt road. And they never came back to the cottage again. Now they had to tell my grandparents something, because they didn't want to say, we were scared to stay in your cottage. So what they told them was that, they didn't have disposable diapers, they were all cloth, I was a baby, no washing machine in the place. It was really hard to have a baby under those conditions, and it was not going to be a very good vacation. So they'd rather take day trips from home where there were modern conveniences. And so my grandparents bought that, made sense. So nobody talked about the cottage again, until 3 years later. My father sat down to read the Boston Globe, and he looked at the Boston Globe magazine. And in it, there was a story about a horrific murder that happened in a cottage in Ossipee, New Hampshire. So he ran to the phone and called my grandfather and said, could this have been your cottage? And my grandfather said, well, yeah, a murder did happen on the property. And we didn't tell anybody, though, because we didn't want them to feel creepy when they were there. So, well, now the secret was out, so every summer when the extended family came over, we always heard right around dusk the story of the haunted cottage. So for years I grew up hearing this story. So finally I decided I really want to know what happened, if anything, at that cottage that could have made them feel creepy because of, like it was haunted. Because they weren't that kind of people. They weren't the tarot card, fortune teller, the horoscope kind of people. And so it was really weird that they would feel that way. And I uncovered a story that was so sensational, I could never have thought it up myself. And that's what the book is about, the story that I uncovered, starting with the haunting. And it's this book right here.